Welcome to our third week of the Get Ready, Get Prepared info session on hurricane preparation. So again, I want to thank you all, and of course this evening we'll be having several, I would imagine, dynamic and very interactive presentations, right? So make sure to pay attention because we all know what happens at the end. And for the newcomers, maybe you might want to whisper, for those of you who's been here before, whisper in the ears of the newcomer what we normally do to get them a heads up, right? So the first presentation this evening will be done by the Leaders for Change, and it's entitled EVCA, help me out. Enhanced vulnerability.
Capacity.
That's what I meant, right? Yes. So please help me welcome Mr. Mitch Hosford to give the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mitch Hosford. I'm here on behalf of Leaders for Change. Here I have Ashma Burkle. She's the Managing Director. Raise your hand up in the air. Thank you. Okay. So, by a show of hands, if I say enhanced vulnerability and capacity assessment, does it ring a bell? Be honest. No? Okay. So now I know what I'm dealing with. Okay, so what is EVCA? It's a community aspect where you participate with each other to identify your risk. When I say the word risk, what do come to mind as a community level? Think about hurricanes.
Hurricane that pose a risk.
Okay.
The stuff in the community that poses a risk during disaster.
Ah. You said a keyword. Okay. You said a very good keyword. Okay, so that's one aspect. The second aspect, it focuses on communities developing something called risk plans and adaptation plans. So you identify what your risks are, and at the community level, you say, okay, this is what we're going to do to lessen those risks. Also, too, it's multi-sectoral. So even though you're doing it at the community level, you have community councils, you have churches, you have government, you have private businesses. All of them should be invested in this process. And it's It's multi-sectorial, meaning that if it happens in one section of the economy, so for example, if it's political, for example, it could also affect the environment. It can also affect social aspects as well. What I explained previous, that it's multi-sectoral, that we're focusing on the different civil society aspects. Okay, so why do we do EVCA? When you think about the word climate change, what comes to mind? Rising sea levels. Okay, what else? Rising temperatures. So now as a community, you are very much involved to understand that these things are happening. The question is, do the other people in the community identify that as a possible risk? So this is the reason why it's important to do a community initiative like EVCA to dialogue with each other to say, okay, climate change is happening. What can we do at a local level to do something to mitigate it? Okay. Then we talk about practical actions. So let's say, for example, we're going to see something called a transit walk. You walk through your community, and you identify that there are large trees that are hanging over roofs. And you say, okay, it's not my roof, it's not my tree, but if the tree breaks, it's a hazard. And then it could fly into somebody else's yard, it could fly into your yard. So those small practical things, by just identifying as a community, this is a major hazard, right? Then it also gives the actionable point of creating risk reduction plans. So basically, you do a transit walk, you identify there's trees. You identify there's zinc. You identify sewage. You identify multiple things within your community. Then you could also identify at what level are we going to prioritize these aspects. So as a community, when you're discussing, you say, okay, these aspects of much more, take more priority because we see it being as equal as an important aspect to solve, for example. So when you look at the why to do EVCA, you're doing it at a community level, you're trying to mitigate your risk, and you're trying to do practical things about it, right? Head shaking, yes? Makes sense thus far? All right. Have you ever seen this article before, or this campaign, I should say? Disasters are not natural. When you see this, what sparks in your mind? Sorry?
I said natural disasters are ironic.
Okay. If I tell you disasters are not natural, you wouldn't believe me. So basically, you would say some.
Yes.
Okay, tell me which some would be natural to you.
A hurricane, we can control nature.
Okay,
But a riot, for example, is not natural, that's man-made.
okay, okay. Flooding. Okay,
Earthquake, be natural.
okay,
Some things beyond our control.
okay. I love that. We're going to keep with that one. I love that one. Okay, so if I tell you disasters are not necessarily natural. They're not natural. There's nothing called a natural disaster. Because what they say is, if you can do something about it, because a hurricane, an earthquake, flooding are hazards, but if you could do something about it as a community and mitigate the disaster aspect of it, then it's not a disaster per se. It's how resilient are you with the coping mechanisms that you have to be resilient or even progressive. So the idea of it being natural is very more of a mindset to say, okay, I can do something about this. So if I can clean my drains, that mitigates the hazard of it being a disaster. See? Make sense? Clubs? Okay. So let's say, for example, everyone in here is in the same community. And we do something called a transit walk. So we're walking and we're identifying that some homes have hanging trees. Okay? By a show of hands. Is this a disaster? Or is it a hazard?
It's a hazard.
Uh-huh. Why is it a hazard? Correct. It has the potential to be a disaster, but it's not, because you can do something about it, right? So the most important thing here is about the mindset. So if you could do something about it, it's not a disaster. If you can develop coping mechanisms, it's not a disaster. If you can anticipate it coming and do something about it, it's not a disaster. I feel like I'm preaching. What could make it a disaster? These hanging trees.
Negligence.
Okay. Okay, negligence. So negligence was one of them you mentioned. What else? Think about the multi-sectoral aspect. So if there is a lot of trees hanging over and it crack and then it start to fly, it break into people's windows, hit people's roofs, then you have what situation you have? You have structural damage. So now you have a multi-sectoral aspect. So it's no longer just having the disaster of these trees breaking down, but it creates a multiplier effect, right? So when we think about mitigation and reduction of that, we really focus on making sure that we lessen the disaster stage. When you, through the EVCA process, you look at it through this type of continuum. So as a community, let's say, for example, you decide to say, St. Peter's community, South Reward community, we come together and we say, let's get everyone of a different race, nationality, creed, doesn't matter. We're pulling them together. And then we're going to sit down, and then we're going to ask ourselves a simple question. What is affecting us? Right? Because now you want to prepare for the hurricane. What is affecting us as a community? Then you say, okay, why is it affecting us? And where is it affecting us? So how vulnerable are we as a community with the things that we identify? And this could be very simple, practical things, right? Then you ask yourself as a community, what do we have to face it or to mitigate it, right? Then we say, okay, how does it or how will it affect us? So if we identify what the hazards are and we look at what the vulnerability is, then we say, okay, this is what we have. How could we identify the risk and make ourselves resilient, right? So when I think about it, I say, okay, I could say we have an issue with hanging trees in our community. We have loose zinc everywhere. It may not affect me, but it can affect somebody else. It can affect a senior. It can affect a disabled person, for example, because they don't have the capabilities of doing something about it. But someone in that group has the mechanical will and ability to keep the community clean. So you have a capacity, right? And keeping your community clean creates a less of a chance of your own property getting damaged. So you're not only doing it for your neighbor, but you're also doing it for yourself, right? So that's the mindset we want to evoke with EVCA, right? And then we can say, in the month of June, July, we create a little bit of an action plan. I'm going to put you a little bit on spot. Sorry. So let's say, for example, as a community South Reward, you say, okay, here's a little bit of our action plan. Let us go to the government of St. Martin and say, hey, we need these practical items for us to prep, to mitigate, right? And that is something, as a community, you could do as grassroots movements. It's important not to say, we leave it there, we're not going to do anything about it. It's your community. You have to mitigate the risk, right? Okay. So, EVCA, like I mentioned, is all about community resilience. We have a tool called a transit walk. And basically, like I mentioned, the community comes out and they engage with the different community members just to identify their hazards, right? You keep hearing me saying this word multiple times. What it does is just imagine a community just walking through, identifying its vulnerabilities and capacities of the various people within the group so that they can potentially create a disaster plan of activities, right? So it may not only be cleanups. It can be that you go and you check your neighbor who is a senior, for example. Is maybe you go down and you check, okay, I know Bobby, if Bobby trench is clogged up, Bobby trench gonna affect my house. So let me clean up this trench with Bobby. Let me knock on Bobby's door and say, Bobby, I watched your trench. Let's do something about it. So it's very much initiative, you know? When you do your transit walk, you identify you gotta do debris cleanup, check on seniors, cut down trees. And these are very simple, practical aspects that you can do. I'm gonna keep reiterating that point. Don't think about it in this big overall concept. So if you go and you knock on the door of government and they say, we don't have the means to do it, that does not mean as a community that you can't do anything about it. You can say, okay, let's meet, let's discuss. What do we have within our means to get it done, right? Take the initiative. That's the most important factor about EVCA. It's very localized. Also in EVCA, this one gets a little bit more technical. You can have something called mapping. So in mapping, it's part of your risk reduction plan. So you identify in your mapping, if I may, touch it. So you can't really see it, but it maps out the capacity. So for example, you can identify where your shelters are, where your churches are, and those could be, how do you say? Shelters, thank you. You identify where the single parent households are, where your seniors be, persons with disabilities. So for example, when organizations come in like the Red Cross or Samaritan Purse, and they come in and say, okay, we have some stuff that we want to give out, but we don't know who to give it to. As a community, you can say, here is our map. It may not be correct precisely, but you give them an indication on how to best use the resources that they have, right? Especially in immediate response, right? They're coming in after 72 hours, they don't know what they're doing, here's a community risk map, right? Here's you can identify how to best use what you have. The map before talked about vulnerabilities. This map looked at the capacities, so the shelters, the supermarkets, and so forth. The key takeaway is to ensure that you have the mindset to do something about your risk within a community. But it's important for you to identify them as a collective. So it's a collective action saying, okay, we all have issues within our community. Let us discuss it. And I know sometimes that's the hardest part, to pull people out of your community to have a discussion with them. But it's very essential because, like as you mentioned, that treatment's been there for years. But it's important as a community to say, okay, we collectively see this issue. Let us collectively do something about it. So that's a major takeaway of today. Ashma and I have done EVCA in Simpson Bay, Dutch Quarter, and Cole Bay. Correct. So in 4 different communities. So if you have any particular questions, you can reach out to our Managing Director, Ashma Burkle, at leadersforchange2017@gmail.com. And either or I would respond.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for that presentation. And now I'd like to invite the department head, of course, Mrs. Chantale Groeneveldt George, to give her presentation on shelter management.
This is the 3rd information session that we are providing for you, the people in the community. Tonight, I'm going to touch base on the emergency shelter. Emergency shelters, what are they? They are safe locations that the populace can utilize in the event of a tropical storm, hurricane, or any other natural disaster. Emergency shelters are seen as a viable, safe shelter option, especially in situations where you have been instructed or have decided to evacuate or because you don't have anywhere else to go. Types of shelters. There are 4 types. You have the emergency shelter, which is then usually operable for 72 hours, the first 72 hours. Usually when we hear that a tropical storm is coming, depending on what this tropical storm entails, we can decide to open an emergency shelter. Then you have the recovery shelter. So after the hurricane passes, the 72-hour passes, and we then go over to a recovery shelter because the country then go in recovery mood. I must mention that in an emergency shelter, everyone can make use of it. So it doesn't matter your gender, your nationality, your ethnicity. It really and truly doesn't matter. It's about us providing people in need of a shelter a safe place. With a recovery shelter, of course, as the country go into recovery mode, the laws of the land, of course, is then even more enforced. So persons that may not have their residencies, they will then be referred to organizations or entities where they can then get the required assistance. The temporary shelter is for approximately 3 to 6 months. That is when, we try and get everybody together in one particular shelter, looking into the possibilities to going over to a transitional shelter where you can stay on a more long term. I must mention that we do have a transitional shelter that is still open. It's located in Sucker Garden. Of course, this shelter opened in 2018 after the hurricane, when we realized that there were 48 people that did not have anywhere to go. So in light of that, we opened a transitional shelter that provides a whole program for these individuals. So it goes from counseling to budgeting. It also provides persons with the opportunity to partake in a saving plan, which of course helps them as they transition back into the community. You would agree with me that when one finds an apartment, you have a down payment, a deposit to pay, you have your GB connections to pay. So the monies that is then saved contributes towards those expenses. Be prepared what to pack into your go bag. So I have a go bag with me this evening. It's a backpack. We always recommend individuals to have a go bag ready. Your go bag should consist of 3 1.5-liter bottles of water, snacks that you may want to eat, chips, not the most healthy, but of course, whatever it is that you like, what you prefer, that is what you will come with. We recommend people to come with their own water because some like Heavenly Water, some like Blue Mountain. So we recommend people as much as possible to come with their own water, their own go bag packed with the things that they would require. Come with a small sheet. You could also think about a towel, your wash rag, your toiletries, whether it's powder, toothpaste, your toothbrush, your lotion. Of course, not forgetting your important documents, your passport if you're married, a married book. If you have property, your notary papers, put them all in a plastic bag. And of course, your soap. These are some of the things that we recommend people to pack in their go bag in the event that you may have to move out of your house seeking shelter. The list of the shelters on the Dutch side. So we have 11 shelters that we would need to manage should that be required. Here to my right is this shelter is the Melford Hazel shelter. The second one is the Dutch Quarter Community Center. The third one is at the St. Peter's Community Center. The fourth is the John Lamini Center. Here down below is Milton Peters Gym. Then, of course, we have the Simpson Bay Community Center. That is also a shelter. And these are the lists here before you. So MPC Gym, Rupert Maynard Community Center, NEPA, which is in Cahill, Simpson Bay Community Center, Methodist Church in Cold Bay, Great Bay Sports Auditorium in Phillipsburg, John Lamini Center, the Little League Baseball Stadium, also in Phillipsburg, Melford Hazel Hall in Sucker Garden, Dutch Quarter Community Center, and Belvedere Community Centers. Be mindful that all shelters are outfitted in an above-ground water reservoir. They also have a generator and hurricane shutters. The shelter team, of course, you could imagine, in order for us to operate a shelter, we need a shelter team. The shelter team consists of a shelter manager, who is then responsible for the daily operations. We then have the police or the military, which is there to enforce safety and order. Then we have NGOs such as Red Cross, Leaders for Change, WIMS, and K1. Of course, Red Cross is there for basic first aid purposes. You have WIMS for more medical purposes, medical care. K1, Leaders for Change, are there for shelter management. Then, should it be required, our shelter team could then expand to the general practitioners for complicated medical issues. You have the social services that provide psychosocial support, mental health foundation for mental health support, but that is more for people that are experiencing whether it's an episode, a psychosis, and they're always on standby. It could also be clients that left their home, were in need of a shelter. Then we have the faith-based organizations, of course, who is there to provide spiritual support. And then you have the court of guardianship. The court of guardianship is there for families with children, so they would support them. You could imagine, in order to operate a shelter, we definitely have rules. And these rules, the shelter manager, of course, puts them up. First, inform all the shelterees about the rules, and we ask them to adhere to these rules as much as possible. In these rules, you could think about pets not being allowed, because there might be someone that has an allergy for a dog or a cat, and we don't want anyone getting an allergic reaction within the shelter. You also have, for example, when the lights has to go out, keep your area clean, respect each other's privacy, and the list goes on. Teamwork. Teamwork is something that we We're definitely big on that. We speak about it often because the success of every shelter management during a natural disaster depends on how good the team work together and the commitment of those. So, and it requires, of course, selfless and tireless effort to ensure that the people that are in the shelter are being assisted in the best way possible.
Just to add to the last presentation, I think it's important to know what you're not allowed to put in your grab bag.
Yes, yes.
So I don't know if you want to share that.
What you're not allowed to put in your grab bag: no soft drug, hard drugs, no alcohol, no weapons. Definitely not allowed. Excuse me? Rubbing alcohol, yes, but no drinking alcohol. And of course, for families with children, we definitely suggest that you come with the toy that the child loves. Make sure that you have sufficient bottles, sufficient milk, Similac. Make sure to have everything that a child needs. And of course, for those that use medication, make sure to come with your medication, because we don't necessarily have we don't have medication at the shelter that we'll be able to provide. Of course, for example, if someone is a diabetic, depending on the situation, they may have insulin. Of course, there are people, depending on the type of diabetes, they may need tablets. So that is something to ensure that you have in your backpack.
It's also important to note that when you come into the shelter, you will be searched, of course, right? Yeah, you'll be searched. Of course, we have to take registration, and there's a big chance the men will be separated from the women. I think we all have an understanding of why. Okay? No? Somebody say no?
And of course, one of the shelter rules being no sex.
Yeah. And the shelter rules will be read out loud, so that everyone is aware of them. And peradventure that you do not comply, we will then ask the police or the military to escort you out. It's very important to know that the laws of the land are applicable in the shelter. So don't think that you can come in and do what you want.